The gate at Millbank. Storage rattles open before the sun has fully cleared the tree line. The gravel lot is already full. Trucks parked at odd angles. Coffee cups balanced on dashboards. A cluster of neighbors standing with their arms crossed, watching one narrow metal door at the far end of the row. Nobody speaks above a murmur. A woman steps out of Unit 14 carrying a cracked leather portfolio, the kind that used to hold contracts for men who wore ties to work. The leather is scuffed at the corners. The clasp is tarnished. She holds it against her chest like it weighs more than it should. Behind her, boxes of old receipts sit untouched. A dented filing cabinet leans against the wall. None of it looks like anything. The auction manager checks his clipboard and calls out that the contents of Unit 14 have officially changed hands. A ripple of laughter moves through the crowd. Someone mutters that she's done it again, wasted good money on a unit full of nothing. She doesn't answer them. She sets the portfolio on the hood of her truck and opens it. The laughter stops first, then the murmuring, then everything. Across the lot, a man in a pressed collared shirt stands, near a black pickup with the company logo on the door. He watches her open that portfolio the way a man watches weather rolling in from the west. He doesn't move. He doesn't speak. But his jaw sets, and he pulls his phone from his pocket without looking away from her. An old man near the front of the crowd, a former warehouse hand who spent 50 years around loading docks and inventory sheets, leans forward and squints at one of the documents inside. He goes quiet. Then he says almost to himself that he thought those agreements were gone, destroyed decades ago along with everything else that Cooperative left behind. Nobody in the crowd understands what he means. She closes the portfolio, gets in her truck, and drives away without a word. 6 months earlier, none of this would have made any sense at all. Her name was Wren, and she'd inherited 300 acres and a mountain of debt the same week. She buried her grandfather. The farm had been in decline for a decade before that. Prices had shifted. Suppliers had consolidated. The small operations that used to service family farms like hers had been swallowed by regional distributors who set prices from a spreadsheet 2 states away. Her irrigation system was patched together with parts that hadn't been manufactured since the Clinton administration. Her tractor ran on borrowed time and a prayer. Every invoice that came through the mailbox felt like another door closing. Her father, retired now and slower than he used to be, still walked to the property every morning out of habit. He worried about the land more than he said out loud. He trusted Wren's judgment, mostly, though there were nights she caught him staring at the ledger with an expression she recognized from her childhood, the look he used to get right before telling her they'd have to wait another year for something. Her younger brother had already made up his mind that farming wasn't worth the fight anymore. He'd taken a job at a warehouse 2 towns over and talked, more often than not, about moving somewhere with steadier pay and shorter hours. Wren didn't blame him. Some mornings she wondered if he had the right idea, but something in her refused to let the place go quietly. She spent her evenings comparing unpaid invoices against a shrinking bank balance, stretching feed supplies further than they were meant to go, calling suppliers to beg for another 30 days before the account went to collections. She fixed what she could with salvage parts and prayed the rest would hold. Meanwhile, the farms around her modernized. New equipment, new irrigation, new supplier deals that came with volume discounts she could never qualify for. She wasn't chasing wealth. She was trying to keep from losing everything her grandfather had spent a lifetime building. That's when she started going to the storage auction. It started almost by accident. A neighbor mentioned that a storage facility across the county line was auctioning off delinquent units, the way they do every few months when renters stop paying and stop answering calls. Most people went for furniture, tools, the occasional forgotten heirloom. Wren went because the entry fee was $5, and she had nothing better to do on a Saturday morning. The first unit she won held almost nothing of obvious value. A stack of rusted irrigation fittings, a crate of obsolete valve components, cracked hosing nobody would look at twice. Except Wren looked twice. She recognized two of the fittings immediately. They matched a discontinued irrigation line still running, barely on half the farms in the county, including her own. Parts that hadn't been manufactured in 15 years and were nearly impossible to source anywhere else. She sold 4 of them to a neighbor for enough to cover what she'd spent on the unit, with a little left over. It wasn't a fortune, but it was the first time in months that something had gone her way. She started paying closer attention to which units came up for auction and who had rented them before. A pattern began to form, one she couldn't have explained to anyone at first, not even herself. The units that interested her weren't the ones stuffed with furniture or electronics. They were the small, forgettable ones, previously rented by retired farm suppliers, mechanics who'd closed their shops, seed dealers who'd gone out of business, cooperative offices that had shut their doors years ago. Inside those units, she kept finding the same kinds of things. Old inventory records, specialized tools nobody made anymore, supplier catalogs from companies that no longer existed, customer ledgers with names she recognized from around the county, warehouse maps, prototype equipment that had never made it to market, contact lists with phone numbers that probably hadn't been dialed in 20 years. She began targeting those units on purpose. Then, in a unit that had once belonged to a shuttered agricultural cooperative, she found a locked filing cabinet. No key, no label except 2 faded initials stamped into a metal plate on the front. She loaded it into her truck bed and drove home without knowing what was inside. Only that something about it made her chest tighten in a way she couldn't quite name. It didn't take long for people to notice. At the feed store, at church, at the diner where half the county ate breakfast on Sunday mornings, word got around that Wren had taken up buying junk at storage auctions like it was some kind of hobby. The jokes were gentle at first, then less gentle. Someone asked if she was planning to open a museum for broken tools. Someone else suggested she'd have better luck playing the lottery. She kept going anyway. The auction fees added up faster than she expected, and each purchase strained a budget that had almost no give left in it. There were weeks she wondered if she was making the same mistake twice, throwing good money after something she couldn't fully explain. Other bidders started noticing her too, though not the way the town did. A handful of experienced resellers, the kind who made a living flipping storage units for profit, began showing up at the same auctions she frequented. They'd noticed her consistency, the way she always went for the smallest, least impressive units, and started bidding against her out of curiosity as much as competition. Prices crept up. Her margins shrank further. When she tried to take some of what she'd found to larger suppliers, hoping to establish a working relationship, she was turned away. She didn't have the purchasing volume to interest anyone. A woman running 300 struggling acres wasn't worth a meeting to companies used to dealing in truckloads. Worse, she began to sense that someone else had started paying attention to her too. A regional agricultural distributor, a company that had spent the better part of 2 decades quietly buying up smaller suppliers and consolidating control over the county's farm equipment and parts market, seemed to know exactly which auctions she was attending. She noticed the same unfamiliar faces showing up more than once. She noticed employees from a company whose logo she recognized, standing near the registration table, clipboard in hand, watching more than bidding. She told herself she was imagining things. Then she won the locked filing cabinet, and the key that should have come with it tucked into an envelope taped to the side according to the facility's inventory sheet, was missing. Someone had taken it before she ever got the chance. The break came from an unlikely place. A retired mechanic named Delbert, a man who'd spent 40 years fixing farm equipment before arthritis forced him into retirement, stopped by her farm one afternoon after hearing through the grapevine about the parts she'd been finding. He looked over the irrigation fittings from that first unit and let out a low whistle. He told her those parts were gold to the right buyer. A small manufacturer 2 counties over had been trying to source components exactly like these for months, struggling to keep aging equipment running for customers who couldn't afford to replace it outright. Delbert made a call. Within a week, Wren had her first supply agreement, modest by any measure but real. A standing arrangement to source and forward specific discontinued parts in exchange for a percentage and first right of refusal on future finds. It wasn't the answer to everything, but for the first time since her grandfather's funeral, she let herself believe the farm might make it. That hope lasted exactly 4 days. She walked into her workshop on a Tuesday morning and found the door unlocked, though she was certain she'd locked it the night before. Nothing expensive was missing. The tools were all there, the equipment untouched. Only the paperwork was gone. Every folder she'd pulled from the storage units, every ledger, every catalog, every scrap of documentation she'd spent weeks organizing on her kitchen table. She stood in that empty workshop for a long time before she moved. The theft changed everything. If someone had gone to the trouble of breaking in and taking only the paperwork, it meant someone understood, or at least suspected, that what she'd been collecting mattered more than anyone realized. Within days, she started hearing that the regional distributor had begun contacting former storage renters directly, the same people whose old units she'd been sourcing from. Auctions she'd planned to attend were suddenly canceled without explanation. Records she'd been told would be available at the county archive turned up, missing or restricted. Former warehouse owners who'd once been happy to chat about the old days grew cagey and short whenever she brought up the cooperative. It felt, for the first time, like she wasn't just hunting for forgotten parts anymore. She was chasing something somebody else wanted to stay buried. Then came the deadline. She learned through Delbert, who still had contacts in the salvage business, that the remaining contents of the long-dissolved agricultural cooperative, whatever hadn't already been scattered across a dozen storage units over the years, were scheduled for final liquidation in less than 2 weeks. Whatever records, equipment, and history remained would be sold off piecemeal or destroyed outright. If she couldn't piece together what she'd already found before that deadline, decades of supplier relationships and inventory history, the kind of information that could reconnect small farms with manufacturers who'd lost track of them, would disappear for good. The clock was running, and for the first time, she understood exactly what she was racing against. She spread everything she had left across her kitchen table. Old invoices, shipping manifests, warehouse maps with routes marked in fading pencil, photographs from cooperative meetings, faces she didn't recognize standing in front of buildings that no longer existed, canceled supplier agreements, handwritten notes in margins, receipts that on their own meant nothing, but together started to form a shape. She tracked down a retired logistics manager who'd worked with the cooperative before it dissolved, a woman named Carol who still lived 2 towns over and remembered more than she expected to. Carol told her something that changed the whole picture. Before the cooperative folded, its members had quietly built an independent purchasing network, small farms banding together to negotiate directly with manufacturers instead of going through the regional distributors who controlled pricing. It had worked for a while. Then funding dried up, key members retired or passed away, and the whole network scattered into storage units across 3 counties, forgotten by everyone except the people who'd once depended on it. Each unit Wren had bought over the past months had been a fragment of that same network. Different pieces of the same forgotten machine, sitting in storage lockers nobody thought twice about. She wasn't collecting junk. She'd been unknowingly reassembling something that had once given small farms real leverage before it was allowed to quietly disappear. Which brings the story back to that morning at Millbank Storage. The final unit, the one holding the last pieces of the cooperative's records, went up for auction with less than a week remaining before the scheduled liquidation. Wren won it, though not without a fight from 2 of the resellers who'd been trailing her for months. Inside, she found what completed the picture: the original agreements, the full supplier contact list, the documentation proving exactly how the network had functioned and who it had once served. She loaded the portfolio into her truck and drove straight to the lot where the crowd had gathered, unable to wait even one more day. When she opened it in front of everyone, the contracts inside weren't random papers anymore. Together they reconstructed supplier relationships, inventory rights, and distribution records that had been scattered across storage units for the better part of 2 decades. The old warehouse hand who recognized the faded seal wasn't imagining things. Those agreements really had disappeared, and really had just resurfaced in front of the entire county. The value was never the physical objects. It was the information. With the records intact, manufacturers who'd long since lost track of their rural distribution history could reconnect with buyers they'd assumed were gone for good. Small farms that had been paying inflated prices through a single regional distributor suddenly had documented proof of an alternative network, one built specifically to give them leverage. The regional distributor had known, or at least suspected, that if those records ever resurfaced, his quiet dominance over local supply chains would face real competition for the first time in years. That was why the auctions kept getting canceled. That was why the paperwork disappeared from her workshop. Wren's persistence had done more than save her own farm. It had cracked open a door that had been sealed for 20 years. Within weeks, 3 manufacturers reached out directly, each offering Wren an exclusive regional agreement built around the records she'd recovered. It was the kind of offer that could secure her family's future outright. Guaranteed supply, favorable pricing, first access to parts and equipment other farms could only dream of. It was also the kind of offer that, if she accepted it alone, would leave every other struggling farm in the county exactly where they'd started, dependent on whichever single distributor controlled the relationship. She thought about her grandfather, about the cooperative he'd likely once been part of without her ever knowing, about neighbors who'd mocked her for months and still deserved better than what the market had given them. She turned down the exclusive deal. Instead, she proposed something closer to what the original cooperative had tried to build. A shared purchasing network open to any small farm willing to join, using the recovered records as its foundation. The farm stabilized within the year. Outstanding debts were addressed. New equipment, sourced through fairer agreements, replaced what had been held together with salvaged parts for far too long. More importantly, the neighboring farms that joined the network gained something they hadn't had in decades: real access, real leverage, real choice in who they bought from. The people who'd once laughed at her for hauling home boxes of old paperwork started showing up at storage auctions themselves, looking not for treasure, but for the kind of overlooked opportunity she'd taught them to recognize. Even the town's attitude shifted. Forgotten knowledge, the kind that sits in a dusty filing cabinet for 20 years, started to look less like clutter and more like something worth protecting. Months later, Wren stood at the edge of the same gravel lot at Millbank Storage as another small unit rolled open. The crowd, smaller this time, watched with a different kind of attention than they once had. A young man, new to the auctions, stepped forward to place the first bid. Wren didn't compete for it. She let him step up instead. Back in her truck, the old leather portfolio sat on the passenger seat, its clasp still tarnished, its corners still worn. A quiet reminder that the biggest discoveries rarely look like much of anything, right up until someone finally takes the time to open them. The storage door stood open behind them both, catching the same early morning light it always had. What once symbolized ridicule now meant something else entirely. Possibility, waiting for whoever was patient enough to look for it.